All right, now we're locked into what most philosophers think is the central problem in the philosophy of mind, and maybe, God help us, the central problem in all of philosophy. How does the conscious mind fit into the physical world? And it'd be nice if we could approach this problem without worrying about our history, but we can't. We're stuck with Descartes, and the truth is we're stuck with a whole religious tradition that says we cannot be just a hunk of matter, just a blob of protoplasm, lost in a I don't want to get wild about this, but anyway, you get the picture. We can't be just that, but there has to be to us a spiritual component. There's got to be a spirit in addition to the body, and that's the basic Cartesian impulse, is that there must be a mind in addition to the body. Now, I often wondered, is this just a feature of our intellectual tradition? I have a friend from Kenya who tells me that in his native language in Africa, they can't even state the mind-body problem. They don't have the vocabulary. God, how I wish we had that language. However, we don't. And then I discovered, well, it's not just peculiar to us, because other parts of the world that have never heard of Descartes, they too have a dualistic tradition. I was lecturing in what was then called Bombay, now called Mumbai, and I was on the same platform with the Dalai Lama. Not every day you get to lecture with God. I don't know if he's God or not, but anyway, he's a big honcho. And he said, we are both a mind and a body. I'm sorry, I'm imitating Jonathan Miller, imitating Peter Sellers, imitating the Dalai Lama. Okay. Anyway, he said, we are both a mind and a body. And I thought, oh my God, we are suffering from Descartes even in Mumbai. But in any case, you can see it fits an urge. Now, in a way, it's not quite Cartesian to say we're both a mind and a body, because the Cartesian says we're just a mind. We're not a body at all. We happen to be stuck with this hunk of junk. But before you know it, we'll get rid of it, and our spirit will float away. God knows where. I mean that literally. And then the question arises, well, while we're stuck with this hunk of junk, with this piece of machine, how could it possibly work? How could the mind ever affect the body and the body ever affected the mind? And it's fair to say nobody got an answer to that question. So traditional Cartesian dualism has very few followers today outside of religion. People who think, well, no, whatever else is going to happen when the body's destroyed, I, the real me, will go on. And the way that I will go on is because I am a spiritual being, not a part of the physical world. Now, that view is, as far as I know, not held by any or very many major contemporary philosophers. Substance dualism is very much out of fashion, even among people who are religiously inclined. See, you don't have to believe in Cartesian dualism in order to believe in the one or more of the world's great religions. But it seems to come rather easily. It seems to come very comfortably. If you accept a religious view of the world, to think, well, really there are two parts to our life. There's the part that's really me, the soul, and then the part that's only incidentally me, the piece of machinery that the soul is somehow, we don't know how, attached to. And Gilbert Ryle used to sneer at this in the passage in the assigned reading, where he says, this is the doctrine of the ghost in the machine. Each of us is a ghost, but the ghost is somehow or other inhabiting a piece of machinery. Okay, now that, in one sentence, that doesn't fit with the past 300 years of scientific investigation. In the early days, in the 17th century, it looked like it might be useful scientifically to accept dualism, because it looked like the sciences could deal with the physical world, with our body and all the rest of the physical world, and religion dealt with the spiritual world, which was out of bounds for science. Well, that's no longer an acceptable view. By the way, Descartes, as I think I told you before, thought that philosophy could do both the physical world and the mental world. Science could do the physical world, and religion, theology, could do the mental world. But philosophy could be imperialistic and talk about everything. Okay, now for a whole lot of reasons, I don't know anybody. Well, I can't say I don't know anybody. There's always somebody who holds every known preposterous view, with very few exceptions. Solipsism is possibly an exception. But what are the alternatives? Well, the general pattern for the past 100 years has been to say we have to deny any independent real existence to mental phenomena. And as you all know by now, this is called reductionism. We have to reduce the apparent physical phenomena to something else, and then follow all the candidates. Mental phenomena reduced to behavior. That's behaviorism. Didn't work. Mental phenomena reduced to brain states, and that's the identity theory, both token identity theory and type identity theory. I think that doesn't work either, but there it's more interesting, and we get more interesting arguments. Or, most recently, mental phenomena reduced to computational states of the computer system that's running in our brain. Now, I think all of these enterprises fail. On the other hand, the alternative that's presented to them seems to me to fail as well. The alternative that's presented is, okay, materialism is wrong, and substance dualism is wrong, but what about property dualism? It's true that the mind can't be gotten rid of. It can't be reduced to something material. But all the same, we can treat the mind as a mental or spiritual property of the brain. And that's called property dualism. And that, I think, is a more plausible view. In fact, I'm frequently accused of property dualism myself for reasons that you will soon understand. I don't think of myself as a property dualist, but I routinely get accused of it. But the problem with property dualism is very simple. If the mental states are not an intrinsic feature of the physical world, then they couldn't possibly make any difference to the physical world. One of the mantras people like to repeat here is, the physical world is causally closed. Mental states can't come sneaking in from outside the physical world and interfere with the physical world. So it turns out they must be parts of the physical world. Otherwise, you're stuck with epiphenomenalism. So we have this absurd situation. It's common in philosophy, but it's an absurd situation nonetheless, where it looks like all of the possible positions lead to absurd results. Materialism leads in its different forms: behaviorism, type, token, computer functionalism. All of those lead to the absurd results that you have to deny the existence of intrinsic mental phenomena. You have to deny the existence of something we all know exists, namely our own mental states. The question that the materialist cannot answer is, inside your brain, are there two kinds of things going on or only one? If you say, well, no, there's just one kind of thing going on, the physical states of the neurobiological system, then it looks like you're denying obvious facts. You're denying the obvious fact that we're all conscious, or in the case of the Chinese room, that we have a semantic content attaching to the symbols. So if the answer is, are there two kinds of things going on in there, or only one, it looks like you have to say, if you just acknowledge the facts, there are two kinds of things going on in my brain. There are neurobiological processes, neuron firings at synapses. And in addition to that, there are conscious states. And that is the impulse that drives dualism, is the recognition of the fact that we have these mental phenomena. Now, to say what I just said just makes most materialist philosophers want to climb up the wall, because it seems to be denying the past 300 years of scientific investigation. Remember I told you when I used to argue with these guys back in the old type identity days, and at the end of one of these arguments, a famous philosopher said to me, "You believe in spooks. You believe in ghosts. You think there's some ghostly stuff going on in your brain." No, I don't. But I haven't told you my view yet. I think if we can just get out of the tradition and the traditional vocabulary, it's not a big deal, the mind-body problem. But I want you to see that it's certainly a big deal historically. And it's a big deal because it looks like there's no way we can satisfy our urge on the one hand to say our mental life is real, and at the same time to say, and I do want to say both of these, the world consists entirely in physical particles in fields of force. There isn't anything else. There's just physical particles in fields of force. And consequently, in some sense, we have to give an account of the reality and irreducibility of the mental, which is consistent with that fact. Now, part of our problem is we're stuck with this vocabulary of the mental and the physical. And I'm going to try to state my views when I get to my own views without using that vocabulary. Okay, so that's to remind you of the framework that we're in. Now, I have been assuming, I've been saying over and over, we're stuck with the fact that we all have mental states. Conscious mental states are the ones that matter, though unconscious intentional states matter as well. But why can't we get rid of mental states? Why can't we say, look, you think you're conscious, but that's just an illusion. What science has shown is that a lot of common sense things that look perfectly real are illusions. There is no arch in the sky when you see a rainbow. It's an illusion. The sun doesn't actually set over Mount Tamalpais. That's an illusion. And similarly with consciousness. You're not really conscious, you just have the illusion that you're conscious. Now, why can't we say that? Why couldn't we show consciousness is just an illusion, one we widely share, but nonetheless an illusion? And the answer is this. The showing that something is an illusion rests on the distinction between the illusion and reality. The reality is that the sun's rays are refracted by vapor in the Earth's atmosphere, and that gives you the illusion that there's a sunset. The Earth rotates on its axis relative to the sun, and we're all moving eastward at several hundred miles an hour right now, and that gives us the illusion that the sun sets in the west. So you have on the one hand the illusion, and on the other hand the reality. Now, your explanation has to explain the existence of the illusion. Now, why can't we do the same move with consciousness? Why can't we show that consciousness is like sunsets or like the rainbows, in that it's just an illusion? And the answer can be given very simply, and this is very important. I want you to grasp this point. You can't make the illusion reality existence, illusion reality distinction for the very existence of consciousness. Because where the existence of consciousness is concerned, the illusion is the reality. If it consciously seems to me that I'm conscious, then I am conscious. People can convince me of all kinds of things, but they can't convince me of, well, we've done a pretty thorough study of your brain, and we've discovered all you got in your head is a pile of sawdust, so you're not conscious. If somebody says that to me, I don't think, oh, God, maybe these guys are right. Maybe I'm not conscious. No, because if it now seems to me that I am conscious, then I am conscious. Where the very existence of consciousness is concerned, you can't make the illusion reality distinction, and that's why you can't do an eliminative reduction on the very existence of consciousness. Now, that's not to say we can't have lots of illusions about consciousness. We do. There are all sorts of forms of self-deception and confabulation that people make about their conscious states. You can be mistaken about your conscious states because they're predictive in various ways. You sincerely thought you were in love, But it turned out that, well, you'd had a lot to drink, and she looked pretty good in that light, and, they had that goofy music playing, and, well, okay, it turns out the next day you were mistaken. You were not in love. That's the kind of thing. I hope that never happens to you, but it does happen to some people, that they have these various forms of illusions and self-deceptions. But where the existence of consciousness is concerned, you can't make the illusion reality distinction. So we're stuck with the fact of consciousness, and yet nobody seems to give us an account which fits all of the data that I've been trying to describe to you. Now later on I'm going to give it. It doesn't seem to me a very big deal. I hope to do it. I'd like to get to it today, but there are various other things I want to pick up, some things I didn't finish last time. And now what I'm going to do in the rest of this lecture is I want to finish the discussion of connectionism. Connectionism had a vogue in cognitive science where people thought, this is it now at last. Okay, so the computational model, the old one didn't work, but connectionism will work, and it will answer the Chinese room, and it solves a 100-step argument and all that stuff. And I think it does not provide a foundation for cognitive science. And I said some things about that last time, but I want to finish that. Okay, that's topic number 1. Or 2. I've already given a kind of introduction. Then the next topic I want to cover today is I want to go over some of those arguments, Frank Jackson, Tom Nagel arguments, and possibly Saul Kripke's argument about rigid designators, and show how the materialists tried to answer them, and show how I think the answers don't work if you understand the force of the argument correctly. And then if there's time, I'll give you a solution to the mind-body problem. What the hell? It's the day after Valentine's Day. We ought to have a solution to the mind-body problem. Okay, so any questions about what I said so far? Is everybody up with us? Yeah?
The whole sunset and rainbow illusion.
Yeah.
Isn't there kind of 2 ways to answer that? One where you're saying or that consciousness isn't a rainbow, and then the other one by saying that even if it is a rainbows, you're still leaving the illusion. A reductionist really does leave that territory of an illusion. So even in proper scientific reductions, there's still that aspect that remains a problem with consciousness, where you don't reduce the illusion.
Yeah, let me show you, let me explain. This is a very good question. The question was, well, look, if you're going to challenge the analogy with rainbows, the challenge has to be something like, look, you didn't eliminate the illusion when you showed the distinction between illusion and reality. And I think that's a very deep point, so let me expand on it a little bit. It's common to say in the textbooks that there's a distinction between eliminative reductions and non-eliminative reductions. If I reduce the table to sets of molecules, I don't eliminate the table. There's still a table there at the end of the day. But a reduction of water to H2O, that doesn't eliminate water. That's a non-eliminative reduction. But I give you the examples of rainbows and sunsets because they show that the thing that you were reducing didn't really exist, or didn't exist as such. It was only an appearance. See, the stuff I'm about to drink doesn't just have the appearance of being water. It really is water. But you can reduce it to H2O molecules. But the arch in the sky and the sun setting behind Mount Tamalpais really are illusions. Okay, now any reduction has to do what's known as preserve the data. You have to preserve the evidence. You have to account for the data that gave rise to the problem in the first place. Now you can do that with sunsets and rainbows. You don't deny that it actually looks like a rainbow. In fact, if it doesn't look like a rainbow to you, there's something wrong with your vision. It isn't that you've got a special visual system that penetrates right through to reality. The existence of the illusion is a standard visual phenomenon. Same with sunsets. Okay, so you have to preserve the data. You have to be able to explain what gave rise to the problem in the first place. Now, one way to put the problem that with reductionist accounts of consciousness is to say that in the reduction of consciousness, all the reductions are eliminative. There couldn't be any such thing as a non-eliminative reduction because you're showing that consciousness is really something else and not what it seems to be. But in the case of consciousness, you can't make the eliminative reduction because where the existences of consciousness is concerned, you can't distinguish between the appearance that you're conscious. It now consciously seems to me that I'm conscious, and the existence of consciousness. If it now consciously seems to me that I'm conscious, then I am conscious. So that, I mean, and this Descartes' right about that. There's more Cartesianism in us than we realize. Once I was in the hands of an incompetent dentist. Don't ever let this happen to you. And the guy gave me this stupid injection. This was in England, where the dental education has some doubtful features. And it hurt like hell after he'd injected me. And I said, it hurts. And he said, it doesn't hurt at all. Well, now wait a second. Now, I'm a Cartesian when it comes to the very existence of my pains. You don't tell me whether or not it hurts. I tell you whether or not it hurts. Okay. I mean, I think his attitude was more the stiff upper lip sort of attitude. Mustn't grumble. But in any case, where the very existence of conscious states are concerned, you can't make the illusion-reality distinction, and that's why reductions fail of any kind. And of course, there couldn't be a non-eliminative reduction of consciousness, because to eliminate consciousness, to reduce consciousness, is to eliminate it. Okay, so we're stuck with the existence of consciousness, and property dualism seems to be making a comeback. It seems to be becoming intellectually respectable, but it has a real problem. And the problem is, if consciousness exists as some non-physical feature of the brain, then it looks like you're stuck with epiphenomenalism, because there's no way some non-physical feature of the brain could ever affect anything physical. Suppose in my brain there's a mind. How is it supposed to affect my behavior? Does it get a hold of the axons and dendrites and give them a big shake? Or does it sneak in to the synaptic cleft when nobody's looking and shake the postsynaptic receptors before the neurotransmitters even have a chance to get there? I mean, just to say this is to make it sound ridiculous. So it looks like you can't give a property dualist account of the mind. So what's the correct solution? Well, I'm going to resist answering that for a few minutes and go on. To finish talking about connectionism, the 100-step argument seems to me a correct objection to the traditional of a computational model of the brain. If you think of the brain as a digital computer, it goes step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. Well, the neuron firings are so slow that in 500 milliseconds you couldn't do more than 100 steps, and any programmer will tell you 100 steps is not enough to do anything very interesting. Certainly not enough to do such things as face recognition or sentence understanding. So however the brain works, it can't be that way. Then that looks like that it shows, well, it must be a connectionist machine, and I won't draw my incompetent drawing that I did last night. I can do it if anybody is puzzled by it. You'll have time for questions in a second. But I want to suggest, no, what it really shows is it's wrong to think of the brain as the hardware of a computer. The brain is an organ like any other. Nobody says, well, the stomach is really a computer, or the liver, that's really a computer, a hell of a computer. No, they think these are physical organs, they operate on physical principles, and you can simulate their operations computationally, as you can simulate anything computationally if you can give a precise enough description. You can simulate weather patterns in California, the flow of money in the Brazilian economy, and the influx of freshmen into the University of California, even when the tuition is going up astronomically. You can simulate anything that you can describe precisely. So of course you can do a computational simulation of the brain, but the brain is not intrinsically a digital computer. Then I made what I thought was the deepest objection, namely the notion of computation is observer relative, and consequently, except for those few cases where some human being is actually intrinsically adding 1 + 1 to get 2, or doing long division, nothing is intrinsically a computer. Something is a computer relative to a computational assignment. So if you ask, well, is the brain a computer? If the question asks, is the brain intrinsically a computer? Nothing is intrinsically a computer. Something is a computer relative to a computational assignment. If you ask, yes, but can we make a computational assignment to the brain? You can make a computational assignment to anything. If you can give a precise enough description, you can give a computational a description of it. You can assign a computational interpretation. And I gave you various examples about that, how you can treat the falling object as an analog computer. It computes a standard function s equals 1/2 gt squared. Okay, but now there is a deeper, there's another deep point. I think that's the deepest point, but there's another point that I want to emphasize, and that's this. If somebody says, well, at last we have a foundation for cognitive science with computationalism, but not a traditional computationalism, but the parallel distributed processing, the connectionist model of computation, then you have to point out to them that we know from the Church Turing thesis that any computation you can do on any computer, you can do on a universal Turing machine. So if we're to think of the brain as a connectionist computer, then it turns out there are no additional computational power carried by the connectionist net. Anything you can do with a connectionist computer, you can do on a traditional machine. The traditional machines, by the way, are called von Neumann machines, after John von Neumann, and he gets credit for inventing the architecture that you now have in front of you if you've got your laptop open. I saw a program on NPR that says he shouldn't really get credit, that some other guy invented it and he stole it. I don't know about that. I'm not arguing with von Neumann and his friends, but it's called a von Neumann machine because he usually gets credit for the architecture. But the point is, it goes 1 step, 2 step, 3 steps. It goes in this linear fashion, whereas a connectionist net goes with a whole lot of computations operating in parallel and in a way that's interactive, where they interact with each other. That's why it's called parallel distributed processing. And I use these terms more or less equivalent. Parallel distributed processing, or PDP, as us insiders call it, and connectionist networks. I use them equivalently. I think there's probably some arcane guys who can tell you, no, there's a deep distinction between a connectionist network and parallel distributed processing. Those are sometimes called neuronal net modeling. That's another piece of jargon you'll use. But the point I'm making now, I'm making 3 points. One, computation is always observer relative, never intrinsic. Hence, a science of the mind, it's intrinsic only for conscious agents doing it consciously. For a science of the mind, you want to know how does things work intrinsically, not in an observer relative fashion. And secondly, that any computation you can do on a connectionist network, you can do on a von Neumann machine. It has no additional computational powers. We know that from the Church Turing thesis. And what was the third? God, I don't know. I'm not even wide enough awake. I think, there was a third one. I think I said this already, that the computation was an observer relative phenomenon. That's the deep point. And the second point is that the computational power of the connectionist network is in no way superior to any other computational, to a universal Turing machine, because a universal Turing machine can carry out any computation. The third point is, and that is, if you're going to take the connectionist hypothesis as adding something new to the traditional computational models, then you have to take it as suggesting that there's something in the architecture, there's something in this architecture that marks the causal difference. This architecture, remember, being where you have an input layer, an output layer, and a whole lot of hidden layers in between, and a whole lot of connection strength between the elements. It's just laziness that keeps me from drawing a better network than that. You have the output layer, the input layer, and then a whole lot of hidden layers. And the hypothesis has to be, well, no, there's something about this particular pattern which gives it powers that the von Neumann machine doesn't have. But now I want to say we're no longer doing cognitive science if we say that. We're doing speculative neurobiology. we're speculating that the secret of the operation of the brain is that it has to work in networks like that. But then I want to say, once you grant me that, then why do speculative neurobiology? Why not respect the facts and get in there and start looking at the damn neurons and neuronal nets and how they actually function? And later on in this course, I want to get to that, because that, I think, is the most exciting project in the sciences today. How the hell does the brain do it if the brain is an organ like any other? What's special about all those neurons? See, incidentally, there are about 1 million neurons in your stomach. I don't know what the hell they're doing there, but there are about 1 million neurons in your stomach, and they're not, in my case at least, they're not conscious. I have no stomach consciousness in addition to all of what it's like stuff going on in here. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about connectionism. Now we're going to go to the anti-materialist arguments by Nagel, Jackson, and Kripke. And then, if there's time, I'll solve the mind-body problem. Okay, questions? Yes?
Okay, so where do we draw the line between, like, philosophical investigation,
Yeah.
for example, and, like, neurobiology?
Okay, this is a very good question. Where do we draw the line between philosophical investigation and neurobiology? And the answer is we don't. You just use any damn weapon you can lay your hands on, and use any weapon that works. All my life, people have been telling me, what you're doing is not really philosophy. Well, who cares? I mean, I go to Germany a lot. And I worked on speech acts. They like that. Sprechakte. Sounds like heavy-duty stuff. And then I got interested in the mind, and they thought, no, you mustn't do that. Searle does Sprechakte, not Bewusstseinsphilosophie. And Bewusstsein, that sounds terrible in German. That's consciousness philosophy. And then I got interested in the brain, the Gehirn, das Gehirn. And they said, there's Searle 1, Searle 2, and now Searle 3. The Gehirns, well, who cares? I mean, let's just get to work. But I don't make the distinction. However, there is an interesting question that I should address, and that's this. Why do we do these dumb thought experiments? I mean, the guy in the Chinese room, why not get a guy and put him in a room and give him all these damn symbols? Why not, do real hard lab work instead of just goofing off with these thought experiments? And actually, there are some funny cases of this. The BBC did a wonderful program. I can put it on reserve, or I could even maybe put it on the net if we can get it in a digital form, where they actually enacted the Chinese room. And it's beautifully done. There's this great big tent with a smiling face painted on the side. And these beautiful Chinese actresses submit questions in Chinese through a hole in the tent. And then after a while, after some noise, the tent spews back answers to the questions. And they ask in Chinese, but does he really have a sense of humor? So they probe him this way, and then he submits a bad joke in Chinese. The tent does. So it's the Chinese tent in this case. And then the magic moment comes when they open up in the tent, and inside there's a tweedy Englishman moving bits of cards, going through a bunch of card filings and giving back answers from his card filings. So they actually carried out the Chinese room. Well, this provoked outrage when it was shown, and as far as I know, it wasn't shown in the United States. I've heard people claim to have seen it, but it was shown widely in England, and normally those are shown in the United States in a series called Nova or something like that. Now, and they didn't want to touch this one. They didn't like that one at all. But in any case, I can put that on reserve. Okay, why do we do thought experiments? Why don't we do the actual work? Well, of course, to carry out the computations in the Chinese room would probably take millions of years. I mean, the reason that we do the thought experiment is you can't actually go through the millions of steps necessary, which supposedly the brain does, or a digital computer would do in order to process sentences. But that's not an objection. I mean, it's not. When Einstein, in a famous thought experiment, said, imagine that you're riding on a beam of light. and you're riding on this beam of light going out into outer space. Now, it's no answer to Einstein to say, well, you'd fall off, or it would be too cold, or, I mean, that whole point of the thought experiment is you can't actually carry it out. Yes, but then why is it legitimate? The answer is, what we're trying to get at are conceptual distinctions. And that's what most of these arguments, Nagel and the What It's Like to Be a Bat, Frank Jackson and What Mary Knew, the Chinese Room, what they're trying to get you to see is the concept of the functional relation isn't sufficient for the concept of the mental. And you can see that by showing you can have the functional relations and not have the feeling of what it's like to be a bat. Or you can know all the functional relations and not know what it feels like to be a bat. You can know all there is to know about color but not know what red looks like. You can go through all the steps in the computer program and still not understand Chinese. So the point of the thought experiment is to discover conceptual relations that are already present in language. And that's why it's, for example, different from the kind of experiments you do to find out whether or not HIV is really the cause of the AIDS symptoms. There you've got to specify more than just concepts. You've got to specify some actual causal relations. So thought experiments are crucial in both philosophy and the sciences, but they play a special role in philosophy because we're interested in finding out whether or not the concept of computation includes the concept of understanding. It doesn't. Whether or not the concept of functional relationships include what it feels like to be a bat or what it looks like when something is red. Okay, more question. Yeah.
Sorry, the reason I ask is because sometimes in like these back and forths, you'll find that someone makes an appeal to a scientific claim, and then it's almost like the other side. I don't know if it's a cop-out or for what reason, but they're like, oh, it's almost like you're cheating by appealing to these sorts of... And then at the same time, you have some arguments that don't appeal to scientific accounts. And it says, well, you failed to explain how this and this works. It should only be done through a scientific explanation. So that's why I'm curious as to like what the...
Okay, the question was, well, look, sometimes it seems like I'm appealing to a scientific result, and other times not. So what's the principle? And the answer is, tell me the question, and I'll tell you what kind of weaponry I need to answer the question. Now, I think, in fact, I'm convinced that our real understanding of the relation of consciousness to the brain will come when we get a better neurobiology that is able to answer the question for us, to show how exactly do neurobiological processes cause consciousness, and where and how exactly are those processes realized in the brain. And for a long time I thought, okay, I've had my say, I'm going to get out of this field, out of the philosophy of mind, because now I think the neurobiologists can take over. But the problem is that they're as dumb as the philosophers. I mean, they busy think, well, really, we got to get a computational model. That's what we're really looking for. Or there was a long time, literally decades, when they would give me the following argument. They would say, and these were intelligent neurobiologists, I mean, Nobel Prize winners, some of them, and they would argue as follows. Look, science is objective, and you admit that consciousness is subjective, so there can't be a science of consciousness. It gives me a stomachache to hear that argument because it's so bad. There's a pun there on objectivity and subjectivity. Objectivity and subjectivity are ambiguous between an epistemic distinction in types of claims and an ontological distinction in modes of existence. Now, let me explain that to you. That's probably the most important. If I haven't told you this already, I won't hurt. If I've told you it already, I'll tell you again. Epistemically, there's a distinction between the claim that Rembrandt was born in 1606. That is epistemically objective. You can settle that as a matter of fact. But now how about the claim Rembrandt was a better painter than Rubens? Well, I think it's obviously true that he was a better painter, but I know a lot of competent art historians and critics who disagree with me. That, as they say, is a subjective matter of opinion. So epistemically, I'll take a question in a second. There are two different kinds of claims. Those you can settle as matters of fact, and those that are, as they say, matters of subjective opinion. By the way, you'd be surprised how your opinion of these artists can change. I went to a huge exhibit of Rubens in Lille Not my favorite town. But anyway, and I had to stand in the rain for an hour to get in. But once I got in, you see what the guy was trying to do, and there's more to it than you might realize. It's not just acres of fat female flesh. I mean, there are a lot of that too. But he actually had an intellectual grip on the material. Still, Rembrandt's a much better painter. Okay, that is subjective. But now in addition to that distinction, there's a distinction in modes of existence. Pains and tickles and itches all have a subjective ontology. Remember, ontology means how does it exist? It's a way of existing. Pains and tickles and itches are subjective because their existence depends on being experienced by a subject, human or animal. Whereas mountains and molecules and tectonic plates are objective because their existence does not depend on being experienced. Now, and this is the point of making this distinction. The fact that a domain is ontologically subjective, like the domain of consciousness and pains and tickles and itches, the fact that a domain is ontologically subjective does not prevent us from having an epistemically objective science of that very domain. Yes, consciousness is ontologically subjective. Yes, science is epistemically objective. But that's no obstacle to having an epistemically objective science of a domain of consciousness where the domain is ontologically subjective. I hope I said all that right, but I think you get the idea. And in fact, the philosophers and the neurobiologists say, well, we can't study consciousness because it's subjective and we're objective. In fact, they neglect what's actually happening. If you go into any medical store, any medical campus textbook store, and look in the section on neurology, you'll find these doctors have to know about how pains are caused. They can't think, well, we can't worry about pain because that's subjective. They got patients who are actually suffering, and they need to deal with the suffering, so they need a science of pain. They need an epistemically objective science of an ontologically subjective domain. So the argument, consciousness is subjective, science is objective, so there can't be a science of consciousness. I used to hear that all the time. I don't hear it anymore. And I think now people have recognized that there's nothing about the ontological subjectivity of consciousness that makes it impossible to have an epistemically objective science. It's hard, I agree. You got to know what's actually going on in there, but it's not out of bounds for scientific investigation. Okay, so I hope that answers your question. Now, there's some other hands up that I saw over here. You had your hand up.
I was going to ask exactly what you meant by epistemically and ontologically, because
that's it. Epistemology is that branch of philosophy that has to do with knowledge. And ontology is that branch of philosophy that has to do with existence. And the point I'm making is the fact, and the epistemic, subjective-objective distinction is ambiguous precisely between an epistemic and an ontological reading. And the point to repeat, this is as important as anything I'm going to tell you in this course. The ontological subjectivity of consciousness is no obstacle to having an epistemically objective science of consciousness. Science is indeed objective in that we try to get truths that don't depend on the attitudes of the actual investigators. Nobody says, well, we've got a scientific result, but the result came in Berkeley, and you all know about Berkeley, so God knows you can't trust it. No, because if the result is replicable, then it's epistemically objective, and the fact that people have subjective attitudes doesn't matter. Okay. Now, I'm now finished talking about, I hope, connectionism. And I've made these 3 points, that if it's speculative neurobiology, it's not interesting to us. What we really want is to find out how the brain actually works. And as I mentioned before, there's a lot of research. Now, that book that I put on the suggested reading list, The Mystery of Consciousness, contains reviews by me of a whole lot of books about consciousness, many of them by famous scientists. And so far, they've all failed to solve the problem. There are 2 reviews that are not in there that I could put on BSpace. One of a very excellent book by Christoph Koch called A Quest for Consciousness. and another one which is just going to come out by Antonio Damasio called Self Comes to Mind. And I don't think I can put that on reserve because it hasn't been published yet. I mean, there are copyright problems. Okay, you want to ask more question, and then you. Yeah.
So are observer relative and ontologically subjective kind of the same thing?
No, but they're close. Ontologically subjective means has a mode of existence which depends on being experienced by a subject. That's ontologically subjective. Now, some phenomena are observer relative. Money, private property, government, marriage are all observer relative. And that means there is an element of ontological subjectivity in their very existence. So ontological subjectivity and observer relativity are not identical, but whenever you have a case of an observer relative phenomena, like money, private property, government, marriage, elections, cocktail parties, universities, degrees, and summer vacations, just to mention a few, all of those exist. They have an epistemically objective existence. But because they are observer relative, they have an element of ontological subjectivity in their existence. Now that sounds like a big deal, but it's not. Just think about money. It's only money because people think it's money, but their thinking it's money is a ontologically subjective attitude that they have. Think about it, but I think if you think through, you'll see that something like that has to be right. You had a question. Yeah. Yes, yeah. In one sentence, that's right. You have to add something to that, though, and that is that consciousness, unlike a lot of other ontologically subjective phenomena, involves an awareness right then and there. When you are conscious of a pain, you're aware of the pain right then and there. And it gets more tricky when you think about unconscious mental states, because unconscious mental states are still mental. But then the question is, well, what fact about them makes them mental if they're unconscious? I'm going to come back to that. I can't answer all the questions in one lecture. But the important point for this distinction is that consciousness, being ontologically subjective, exists only when it is experienced as existing. And for that reason, you can't make the traditional appearance-reality distinction, because for the very existence of consciousness, the appearance is the reality. If it consciously seems to me that I'm conscious, then that is enough to guarantee the ontological subjective existence of consciousness. Okay, other questions? Somebody who hasn't asked a question. Yeah, you. Go ahead. Yeah, you get another one.
Does the word intersubjective?
Yeah, does the word intersubjective mean anything? I wish I knew. I mean, people are always hitting me with intersubjective, and I don't know what the hell they're talking about. I think if it means anything, it must mean collective intentionality. Whereas we're now having a conversation, so there's collective intentionality. But I don't have any use for the notion of intersubjectivity, but a lot of famous philosophers think it's a big deal, and I ought to use it. I just don't know what it means. Okay, let's go on. Now I'm going to talk about... Yeah, all right. What the hell? Yeah, Nagel, Jackson, and Kripke. There is an argument against them. There are a bunch of arguments, but one I'm going to mention first is against both Nagel and Jackson. And I think it is a bad argument. But here's how it goes. All right, we're going to use this one. They seem to be saying that we can know something about the bat. We can know all there is to know about the bat's neurophysiology and about the functional relationships in the neurophysiology. But there's still something we don't know, namely what it feels like to be a bat. Therefore, the feeling can't be identical with the neurophysiology. Can't be identical with any third-person phenomenon. And Jackson seems to be arguing, Mary knows all there is to know about color vision, but she doesn't know what red looks like. Therefore, red cannot be identical Therefore, the experience of red can't be identical with all of the neurophysiology in her brain. Now, if that's the argument that they're giving, then it would be a fallacious argument. Because, of course, the fact that something is known under one aspect and not known under another aspect doesn't show that the two things known are not identical. They may be identical all the same. Suppose somebody argued, look, water can't be H2O because Sam might know that water's wet and not know that H2O is wet. So water's not H2O. That's a bad argument because how Sam knows something doesn't affect how it actually is. So it could well be the case that water is H2O, even though people had some knowledge about water under one description, water is wet, and didn't know that under another description, didn't know that H2O is wet. So if these guys are arguing, well, Mary knows all there is to know about the brain experience of consciousness, but she doesn't know what it feels like to see red. She knows all about the brain phenomena of seeing red, but she doesn't know what it feels like to see red. It doesn't follow that seeing red can't be identical with the brain phenomena. And similarly, if we say, well, we know all there is to know about the bat's physiology, but we don't know what it feels like to be a bat, it doesn't follow that the feeling can't be identical with the physiology. Does everybody see that? It's just like the water H2O. Okay, now I want to say that rests on a misunderstanding of the Nagel and Jackson arguments. Their argument is often put in an epistemic form about knowledge, but it's not really. The form of the argument is this. In the account of the experience of seeing something red, something is left out if all you can describe are the third person phenomena. The first person experience of seeing red is left out. Similarly with Nagel and what it's like to be a bat, just giving an account of the neurobiology of the bat's experience leaves out something essential to the experience, namely what it feels like. Now, it's true that these arguments are often put in the form of knowledge claims. And indeed, Frank Jackson's argument is typically known in the literature as the knowledge argument. But that seems to me to mistake their real logical character. The real logical force of the argument is not epistemic, it's ontological. And what it says is, it isn't whether or not they know it under one description or not under another description doesn't matter. What matters is, are there two things going on in there or only one? Now, on Jackson's argument, there are two things going on. There are a set of neurobiological processes and the experience of red. Now, Mary might know all there is to know about the neurobiological processes, but unless she's had the experience, she doesn't know what it's like to see red. And that is a way of illustrating the fact that there are two things going on. The epistemic point is not the argument, but a way of getting at the underlying ontological point, which is not about epistemology. Same with Nagel. Nagel makes it look as if it's an epistemic argument. We can know all there is to know about a bat's brain and still not know what it feels like. But the point of the argument is to say there are two different phenomena. There are the neurobiological phenomena going on, and there is the actual conscious experience. And we can illustrate that distinction by seeing that we might have a complete neurobiological knowledge, but have no idea what the experience was like. So I think these arguments against Nagel and Jackson don't actually work. Now, there is a slightly technical way of putting this point. And what the hell? It'll only take me a couple of minutes, so I'm going to do it for you. The apparatus that we're using here, the apparatus under discussion, has got a name. And I've told you about it before, but I went through it too fast. It's called Leibniz's Law. And it commonly comes up in philosophical discussions. What Leibniz's Law says is, if two things are identical, they must have all their properties in common. Consequently, if you can show that one of them has a property that the other one doesn't have, you show that they're not identical. I'm going to say that again, just so you can. In fact, I'll put the marks on the blackboard. If two things are identical, x equals y, then that implies, this arrow means implies, that if one of them, x, has the property f, then the other one, y, must have the property f. And indeed here it's an if and only if. If x equals y, then x has f if and only if y has f. That's Leibniz's law, and that is the law of the indiscernibility of identicals. Two things are identical, they got all their properties in common. Now, why is that important in philosophy? Well, if you want to show that something is not identical with something else, you show that one thing has a property that the other thing doesn't have. That is the principle on which the alibi works. If you can prove that the criminal had a property you don't have, he was present at the scene of the crime and you were not present at the scene of the crime, then you've proven that you're not the criminal. Does everybody see that? It's a very important principle in ordinary common sense. Just prove that the guy had a property you don't have, and then you can prove you're not identical with the guy. So this law has the consequence that if you have xf and not fy, if you have fx and not fy, then that implies that x is not identical with y. This is the principle of the alibi. Now, these guys think that that is what Nagel and Jackson are using, that they're using the argument. The experience of red has a property that the neurobiology doesn't have, namely Mary knows one and not the other. And Nagel appears to be arguing, well, the bat neurobiology has a property that the bat consciousness doesn't have, namely we know about the one but not about the other. Then it looks like it would be the same fallacy as the fallacy that is committed if we say Sam knows that water is wet, but he doesn't know that H2O is wet, so H2O can't be identical with water. Does everybody see? That's a bad argument, because it's not an example of this to pick cases where people are thinking about the X or have some belief about the X. Now, he puts it as if it were. Both of them put it as if it were a point about knowledge, but the deep point is about the ontology. There's an element of the ontology of consciousness that's left out by the neurophysiology, namely what it feels like. And that's left out in both the color vision case and in the and in the bat case. So, just to summarize this point, a standard objection to both Nagel and Jackson is that they are misapplying Leibniz's law. They're applying it to cases which involve knowledge and not the actual ontology. So they're trying to apply this law in cases where it doesn't apply, because the cases have to do with not how things are, but how we believe or know or think about them. All right, I want to say if that's what they're doing, they're wrong. But there's a way of interpreting their arguments where it is not misapplying this ontology. And there the interpretation just says, look, there's a fact that's left out. And forget about whether we know the fact or whether or not we have beliefs about the fact. There's a fact that's left out of the bat neurobiology, namely, what does it feel like? And there's a fact that's left out of the facts about the neurobiology of color perception, namely the fact of what does it look like? What's it feel like to see something red? And to put it that way is to put it ontologically and not epistemically. So if their argument's epistemic, then it's a misapplication of this principle. But if it's not epistemic, then, as I think it's not, then this principle is right. Namely, the experience can have the feature that it looks like something, and that's not going to be the same as having the neurobiological properties, so you have to make a distinction between the feature of looking like something and having the neurobiological properties. Okay, so that, just to summarize that is a standard objection to both Nagel and Frank Jackson, and it seems to me the objection fails if you rewrite their arguments in such a way so that they're not committing the same fallacy as the fallacy of saying Sam knows that water is wet, but he doesn't know that H2O is wet. Therefore, water can't be H2O. You had your hand up. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't understand the difference between saying there's a feature that's left out and saying that properties don't matter.
Yeah, it is the same. The question is the argument epistemic in structure or ontological in structure? Now, the way they state it, it looks epistemic. It looks like they're saying, look, there's something that Mary knows when she sees red that she didn't know before. Therefore, what she had before can't be identical with red. And I was saying that's as bad as saying, look, there's something that Sam knows when he knows that H2O is wet, which he didn't know when he knew that water was wet, therefore water can't be H2O. That's a bad argument because it applies this principle in an epistemic way and not an ontological way. If you apply it ontologically in the case of Mary and what it's like to be a bat case, then the argument works. Then you really do have a distinction between the property of feeling like such and the property of having such and such neurobiological features. You had a question.
Yeah. Do you use Liveness Law to say something like consciousness equals brain function plus causality in the neuron?
Okay, this is going to be a problem we're going to get to, and that is, does Leibniz's law work against any identity statement involving a consciousness and states of the brain? And Kripke is going to say, yes, it does work, and that's because both consciousness and the states of the brain, the expressions that name those are rigid designators, and if they were identical, they'd have to be necessarily identical, but they're not necessarily identical, so they can't be identical at all. I'm going to get to that. My problem, as always, I can't say everything at once. However, I promised you I'd solve the goddamn mind-body problem, so let's do it, okay? We got a few minutes. I don't know. Well, I'll talk fast. Okay. Now, when you get one of these hard philosophical problems, always ask yourself, what do you know for a fact? What do you know before you ever got started doing philosophy? And it seems to me we know several things. One, let's take consciousness, because we can get to intentionality later, and I haven't given you enough apparatus to talk about intentionality yet. One, consciousness, I use Freud's abbreviation, CS exists and is irreducible. For reasons I've been telling you, you can't do an ontological, you can't do an eliminative reduction of consciousness because eliminative reductions rest on the distinction between appearance and reality, and you can't make the appearance-reality existence. You can't make the appearance-reality distinction for the very existence of consciousness. If it seems to me that I'm conscious, as it does, then I am conscious. Okay. Now the second point is all of our conscious states are caused by brain processes. They're all caused by neurobiological processes in the brain. And I'll abbreviate that as neurophysiological processes. They're caused by, as far as we know, variable rates of neuron firings relative to different neuronal architectures. Now, I wish I could tell you exactly how the brain does it. Nobody knows. And it annoys me. When I first got interested in this, I went and bought all of the standard textbooks on the brain. And incidentally, if you want to learn a subject, buy the freshman textbooks. There's no problem in your reading them because you're well beyond that stage. And they're designed so that they will explain the material. Any subject you don't know, just go buy the freshman textbook. So I went and bought the standard textbooks on the brain. Some of them were damned expensive, too. And I sat down and read the things. And I got annoyed. I was having an argument with literary critics at the time, and from a literary critical point of view, they really annoyed me because they conceal the fact that they're ignorant. So they tell you all about the microanatomy of the synaptic cleft and the number of carbon rings in serotonin and the hypothalamus. God, I had so much fun in the hypothalamus. I spent weeks in the hypothalamus. But they don't tell you the answers to the question that really bother you. Why are we conscious? What exactly is the neurobiology of consciousness? How exactly do we remember things, and how exactly are memories stored in the brain? We're getting better at that. We now know more about that than we used to know. In those days, we didn't even know why alcohol makes you drunk. We're better at that now. I mean, we got a way to go. We know why cocaine does what it does to you. Namely, it impedes the capacity of the synaptic receptors to reabsorb 3 different neurotransmitters. One is norepinephrine. What are the other 2? Well, you guys look it up. Okay. What cocaine does that gives you this peculiar sensation. Okay. But anyway, we know that the brain does it. We just don't know the details. All of our conscious states are caused by neurophysiological or neurobiological processes. But now the third thing we know is that conscious states are realized in the brain. They're actually going on right there in the brain. So if you have a conscious experience, there is some neurobiological processes that's causing that experience, and that conscious experience goes on right there at that point in the brain. Now, we're getting more knowledge of how it's realized, how these things are realized in the brain, as we get the imaging techniques are getting better. There's always a sort of magic bullet atmosphere to the introduction of any new technology. The journalists always say, now we've got the secret. Now we're going to know how the brain works. Well, no, we're a long way from that. What the fMRI measures is increased brain activity, and you can measure the increased brain activity because of the increased blood flow. So you get a rough idea of how certain cognitive processes are localized in the brain. But we know, even though we don't know the details, we know that all conscious states are realized in the brain. They're caused by neurobiological processes, and they're realized in the brain. They're actually going on right there in the brain. You think about your homework assignment. There are processes in your brain of consciousness going on right there, realized in the brain, and they're caused by neurobiological processes. But now, fourth, we know that consciousness functions causally, that it actually causes features of our behavior. And I'll give you the same boring example I always give you. I decide to raise my arm, and the arm goes up. And it is, again, in philosophy, you have to allow yourself to be amazed by what any sane person takes for granted. And any sane person will take for granted, well, of course, your arm goes up when you raise it. What did you expect? Your hair to stand on end or your toes to wiggle? But that's an amazing fact. And it's an equally amazing fact that it's entirely up to me. Nobody says the thing about the old arm is some days she goes up and some days she doesn't go up. No, she goes up whenever I want her to work. Maybe it's a he. Maybe he goes up whenever I want him to go up. It's entirely up to me. Okay, but now so these are 4 facts about consciousness in the brain that seem to me obvious once you start thinking about them. Now, much of the philosophy of mind is a concern to deny one or more of those, and I want to show how you can have all of those, but how they can all be true. But one of the things that puzzled people is, well, look, if you say consciousness is caused by neurobiological processes, that's dualism, because you've got to have the cause over here on the left, that's the brain, and the effect over here on the right. That's dualism. You're stuck with dualism if you say brain processes cause consciousness. But if you're stuck with dualism, then you can't have causal functioning, because this non-physical juice, this mysterious fluid of consciousness that's squirted out by the brain, but it is a weightless fluid on this picture, because it can't actually cause anything. So you're stuck with epiphenomenalism. So if you accept those four propositions, and I think they're obviously right, then it looks like you've got problems, because now you're back in bed with Descartes, you've got dualism, you've got an insuperable problem, how brain processes could cause consciousness. How could the brain get us over the hump from all these neuron firings to this feeling I'm having now? And then how could that feeling, it's just an airy-fairy ethereal thing, how could it crank my arm so that it actually goes up? Okay, now I want to say something that, as far as I know, most philosophers don't want to say, and that is the problem we're having here is not with consciousness in the brain. It's with the traditional categories. It's with the categories of the mental and the physical, the category of causation, the category of identity. I think in order to answer all of those questions, I'll wait till Thursday. Oh, incidentally, before you snap your notebooks, I gave a lecture on this once in Reno. And all kinds of crazy things happen in Reno, God knows. One thing I said in the course of the lecture, well, behaviorism is dead. Well, it turns out they got a thriving movement of behaviorism in Reno. So there was a near riot when I said behaviorism is dead. Okay, so it's not dead. It's alive in Reno and Tampa. I had the similar experience in Tampa. Okay, but now, don't snap notebooks. I have one more sentence I need to say, and that's this. Somebody asked me, what's the name of your theory? I don't know, it didn't have a name. What am I supposed to say? The truth? I'm not into advertising. So on the spur of the moment, I had to think of a name. I called it biological naturalism. Sounds pretty pretentious. Anyway, next time I'll explain biological naturalism. Hand in your papers.